as well. Also, because you are fixed to one place and one type of survival, you have to defend that or you're in big trouble. So this increases conflict between populations competing for the same lands or a limited space. You're also, by growing crops, you are planting fields of one species of plant, which limits biodiversity, and that has deleterious effects on ecosystems. Also, you don't want wild animals coming and either predating on your domesticated animals or wild herbivores coming and eating your plants. And so you hunt these away or you drive them away, and this leads to loss of wild species. And also, there are health costs from living in large population agglomerations and quality of life implications that we'll talk about here in a second. So we shouldn't think that because we are stepping in for nature that we are now unaffected by natural processes. We are still evolving, but evolution is now affected by these choices that we're making. We try and control the environment, but that environment that we've affected then comes back to us and changes our biology. So something like agriculture, which produces certain types of plant products that we eat, we are selecting what kind of food we have. And so they're softer, they're more nutritious in certain ways, especially carbohydrates and starches. And we don't use the bodies in the same way that we had before. So we've seen this already in prior chapters where developmental biology affects the phenotype. So you are born with a genotype, but you never really see that genotype expressed. It's always filtered through natural processes of growing up and going through development. And that is the phenotype that actually produces the end product. So my genes may be the same or very similar to the genes of my hunter-gatherer ancestors, but, for instance, my face is different because I'm eating a different food. And so a hunter-gatherer that is eating hard-shelled grains and grasses and tougher meat and using your chewing muscles actually develops larger bones and larger muscles. That is a larger face. And so the genes tell our bodies to create a certain number of teeth, and those genes were evolutionary selected for hunters and gatherers. This is the reason why we have things like malocclusion and dental crowding. So anybody who's had to have your wisdom teeth out, it's because human beings' faces have shrunk in the past 10,000 years because we are not using our muscles and our bones in the same way as our hunter-gatherer ancestors are. But our genes are the same and tell our bodies to produce a certain number of teeth that no longer fit into our faces. So this is what's called the masticatory functional hypothesis for why we have dental occlusion problems and malocclusion and dental crowding. So, once again, as I said, there was a long assumption that this was progress, moving from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, and then on to other types of social changes. Humans were going through progressive stages of getting better and better and better. Complex doesn't mean better. And in fact, more recent studies of existing contemporary hunter-gatherer societies show that hunter-gatherers had they work hard to survive, but for fewer hours, and they have a lot more leisure time. They also don't live in crowded areas, which means that they don't have some of the diseases that living in crowds with spread of disease and poor sanitation and that sort of thing can bring on. Also, they used their bodies differently. So our bodies adapted in the past couple 100,000 years. We became humans as hunter-gatherers. We are no longer hunter-gatherers by and large. I certainly am not, and you probably aren't either. Which means that we are using our bodies, our bones, differently. And you can see this in the archaeological record that we shrank. That we hunters and gatherers have stronger, thicker bones, but in certain ways. For long-distance running and extreme physical activity for short bursts of time. This is what's called biomechanics, looking at the way the bones reflect behavior from the past. And we saw this in theory in previous chapters through things like osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So we got smaller in this Neolithic transition because we weren't working in the same way. We were working hard, but only in certain ways. We were hunched over, grinding stones, grinding grain, or we were bending over and planting seeds in the ground, or plowing the soil. But we weren't running long distances, and we weren't using the bones in the same way. And as a result, we actually got smaller. Now, in more recent years, we've gotten larger because in the past 100 years or so, we've gotten slightly larger. In some countries, we saw this as the secular trend because increased access to nutrition has actually gotten us a little bit closer to our genotypic ideal. But new types of problems start to arise. We're evolved to be long-distance runners and hunters and gatherers, but we're not evolved to be. Our bodies aren't evolved to be grinders, people who grind grain on a metate or a grinding stone. And so you can see that this new type of activity, using our bodies in new ways, has actually shows up in the bones. And you have things like osteoarthritis, especially in the back, and you get this osteophytic lipping that occurs in the lower back that shows that you're doing the same activity, hunched over, grinding grain, and this is only on some individuals. And so some people are tasked with doing certain things, and it increases the workload of certain types for some people that produces rampant osteoarthritis in those populations. Also, living in a sedentary lifestyle and having larger groups of people produces overcrowding and diseases. Diseases that we never really had to face before because we didn't live in large enough populations. And these show up in the bones as well through things like a staph infection, Staphylococcus aureus, is something that exists. You get person to person, an infection caused by a bacterium or from poor hygiene, and it can affect bone growth. And so in the archaeological record, we can see things like periosteal reactions, which is a swollen region of the bone, and this shows up. So we can tell that these, what was very rare prior to the Neolithic period to ever see a staph infection in the bones, this evidence starts to arise. It's a very common thing to see these staph infections in the Neolithic and more recent skeletal remains. Also, certain types of crowd diseases can be that show up in the bones. There's some that we don't have very good evidence for because they don't show up in the bones, but ones like treponematoses, like syphilis and yaws, and also tuberculosis, measles, mumps, cholera, influenza, smallpox. These are all crowd diseases that are brought on by people living in very close quarters with one another in these new villages and sedentary populations, and these all show up through in the bones through pocking and things like that, or for some things enlarged or bowed limbs, and that sort of thing. Now, you've probably heard that that when the European colonists came to the New World, to North and South America, they brought with them smallpox, and and that disease didn't exist in North and South America, causing the deaths of many Native Americans. Now, while that last part is true, there weren't a lot of people that had ever experienced smallpox. It's now becoming clear that in the densest populations in the New World, in North and South America, the Aztecs and the Inca, for instance, they actually did have smallpox and some degree of immunity. But because these are crowd diseases, and because so many places in in North and South America were sparsely populated, that is where the resistance, they didn't have the resistance to smallpox. But in the urban areas, the densest populations, there actually was some immunity to this. So in other words, it's not that the smallpox didn't exist in North and South America, it's just that large population agglomerations weren't very common. But where you get large crowds, you get large crowd diseases. Also, the diet of people was changing and causing problems as well. For instance, domesticated plants are high in higher carbohydrates. This is what humans were selecting. They wanted energy. They weren't going for the micronutrients. They weren't going for the B vitamins and things. They were going for starches. They were going for energy, going for sugars. And this created an environment in the mouth for bacteria to produce lactic acid, which breaks down enamel and causes things like, dissolves the enamel of the tooth and causes things like dental caries or cavities, that sort of a thing. So Streptococcus mutans and Lactobacillus acidophilus are a couple types of bacteria that thrive on this high carbohydrate diet that the Neolithic people were starting to shift to. And so prior to the pre-Neolithic people, the pre-agriculturalists, you almost never saw dental cavities in the skeletal remains, but this is extremely common from the Neolithic onwards. And this may seem like a minor thing because going to the dentist and getting a filling today is not a big deal. Or not a particularly big deal. But this is where you need your mouth to eat. And it's a place full of all sorts of microbes. And if you get a problem in your teeth, a lesion or some kind of an open sore or something like that, you can get sepsis and die in a very short period of time. And you need it to live, but it is an extremely vulnerable spot on humans. And a lot of people in history have died from poor dental hygiene. And so this is actually a real problem. This causes is a life and death issue, having a cavity before advanced dentistry came about. Also, nutritional levels. I mentioned we weren't really, the early agriculturalists weren't really caring very much about micronutrients. They didn't really think about that. They didn't have the science behind that. They were going for carbohydrates, things that gave them energy. So staple crops that had carbohydrates. But focusing on that leads to a lack in certain nutritional elements. And we saw how important that was in previous chapters for development, right? So to become a healthy adult, you need to have the right nutrition at the right time to build your body up. And if you're not giving it that, if you're lacking in certain types of amino acids or nutrition, then this will show up in your bone growth as well. And something that was not very evident in pre-agriculturalist populations, pre-Neolithic populations, hunter-gatherers, you start to see evidence for nutritional stress in the bones from the Neolithic period onwards. Things like enamel hypoplasia. This is when your baby teeth come out and your adult teeth start to come in. if you don't have the right nutrition, these horizontal lines will form called enamel hypoplasia, and those are permanent. So when they grow in, your teeth will have evidence that you had nutritional deficiencies. You had malnutrition at the age that those teeth were coming in. So we start to see this in Neolithic populations where we never really saw that before. Also, there's some other types of very specific types of malnutrition that we start to see from the Neolithic period onward, in particular iron deficiency. And this shows up very well in the bone record. For one thing, as I mentioned before, if you're an agriculturalist, if you're growing a crop, you may or may not have animals that you can use for meat. That's a specialist job. And so apparently people weren't eating meat as much anymore. They weren't hunting as much because they were tied to the land. And so this lack of meat is a very good source of iron. It's kind of rare and hard to find iron in other types of foods. Also, certain types of staple crops like corn or maize inhibits the body's ability to absorb iron. This is something that was not known by the people who were early agriculturalists, that the food that they had developed was actually making it harder for their bodies to absorb any iron that they were getting, and they were getting less of it as well. So iron deficiencies start to appear in the skeletal record, and you can see things like porotic hyperestosis, which is like a pocking, a sort of a porosity to the skull, and cribia orbitalia is a porosity around the eye orbits, and there's a picture in your book and on the slides that is so severe that that individual would have been blind. So you need iron. It's an important element of your nutrition. And also living in crowds in unsanitary conditions can bring in about things like hookworm. Hookworm is a parasite that you really find in unsanitary conditions, and that sucks the iron out of your blood. So all of this stuff taking place, you're not getting iron in your food, it's getting depleted by the choices that you're making about what food you do eat, and some parasites coming in and taking it away from you. You start to see traces for iron deficiency after the Neolithic Revolution. This isn't sounding very good, is it, right? But the problem is that once you start down this path, you become locked in. How long do you think it takes before someone that transitions from hunting, gathering into farming and herding, how long do you think it takes before they lose the ability to go back? Before they lose the ability to go become a hunter and a gatherer again? I know I would struggle to do that. If you airdropped me into some place, the middle of nowhere, I would find it really hard to learn how to survive off the land. And we can assume that that was the same case for people that might have been even a half a generation or maybe 1 or 2 generations into being farmers. They would have lost the ability to go back. Also, other people were farming, other people were defending, so it really just of their territories. And so territoriality, living in villages, meant that once you started down this path, there was just no going back. Populations expanded, and culture had to organize itself to deal with some of these new issues. But you find that there were a lot of downsides to these transitions. Nutritional stress, dental crowding, and smaller bones and muscles, degenerative joint diseases, shoulder, knee, lower back problems, malnutrition, tuberculosis, and syphilis. All of these things are consequences of us shifting into the Neolithic Revolution, which at one point was considered to be progress. It did change everything. That's really important to emphasize. But it isn't necessarily progress. It's change, but not necessarily for the better. But now that we have it, it's actually the system that we live in today. The bones and the archaeology tell us about this, and so this is I'll leave you to investigate the evidence for what I've been talking about, but this brings us into the backdrop for how the modern world that we see today got its start.